Warning.
This is the most important
podcast
of our lifetime.
Hello, everyone.
What is Hapatarian?
So what is Hapa? So when you put together Hapatarians, what is that?
You know the thing.
They're here to awkward it up for you guys.
Which is a very interesting and beautiful mix of humanity.
Anyone who has a podcast,
You're an extremist.
Shut up!
all right, let's get to it. Hey, what's happening? And welcome to the Hapatarians Show, the #1 podcast that has never been on a daytime talk show. Please don't forget to subscribe, leave a 5-star rating, and in the comments, tell us how much you love the Hapa ethno-state. Our guest today is someone who is a TikTok sensation, was sued by an American city, and has been on the Dr. Phil show. You can decide which one is the biggest accomplishment. It's the host of The Hourly Struggle, Joshua Ferguson. How are you doing, sir?
I'm okay. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming on. That last part that I said during the intro was that you were on the Dr. Phil show. And that's pretty much the main reason why you're here, was that recently your episode that or your appearance on the episode came on about a week or so, or a few weeks ago, I should say. Let's just say recently.
April 18th.
There you go. Thank you. April 18th. So let's just start there. Can you just talk about the beginning of when they invited you and kind of what your thoughts are? Because I know you had done a Substack too, where after it was all done, but wasn't out yet. The episode hadn't come out yet, but you're kind of like you're having second thoughts even during the film. You're like, I don't know if I shouldn't even be doing this. Why am I here? Or anything like that. But anyway, I'll let you kind of describe the whole beginning when they invited you and all that.
Okay, so apparently the way they were inviting some guests is they were finding people with, I would say, somewhat trending TikTok videos, because that's how they found me. And I've been doing TikTok videos on politics and what have you for about a year or so now, because it's the best place to get engagement, positively and negatively, of course. And at least for me, I can do better on there than any other platform. And so I was doing videos, and the issue of reparations had come up, and I have feelings about that. And the video had, I don't know how many views, 100,000 or so, maybe more views on it. And they reached out to me and they said, hey, we're going to do an episode on reparations. Would you like to be on it? And I was like, no, that's a bad idea. And I mulled it over, and I talked to my wife, and I talked to some friends. And we sort of came to the conclusion of maybe you should consider that, because, you could get your name further out there or what have you, or maybe hopefully, push the show or what have you. And reluctantly, I agreed, because when I talked to them, initially it was just, oh, you're against reparations. And obviously being the lack of melanate, the non-melanated person who looks like a disco ball in the sun, that's why they wanted me on there. Like, I was going to be the bad guy. I was going to be the heel, is sort of what I figured. And as I was talking to them, the other guests, what they had told me it was supposed to be 3-on-3. So 3 people for reparations, 3 people against. And one of the people they had on there was, her whole shtick is she's an anti-racist educator. So she has a TikTok following similar to mine, which is like 60 some odd thousand followers. And her whole shtick is just anti-racism. Okay, fine, whatever. And then they had a professor on there who he's studied the issue of reparations. He's trying to push some $14 trillion plan for reparations. And the more interesting part is there was a lady who was both a descendant of slaves and slave owners. Like, her ancestor owned her other ancestor, and then her family was given many, many acres of land back in the South. And so that was her family history. And in talking to the producers, I said, sort of offhandedly, I'm like, oh, that's interesting, because I'm descendant of an abolitionist, a guy by the name of Orson Smith Murray, who gave money to Harriet Tubman sort of through somebody else, and was mentioned by Frederick Douglass, and had a spot on the Underground Railroad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they sort of perked up on that. They're like, oh, really? And they changed the sort of narrative that they were going to run the show on, where I wasn't just going to be sort of the heel, as it were. That was my interpretation. I was now going to be the counterbalance to that lady. So they asked me to give them a family tree of Orson Murray down to myself, and they were supposed to have me on they were going to bring her on, and then bring me on, and then bring the rest of the panel on. And I was like, okay, that's cool, whatever. So I get there, I agree to do it reluctantly. And I get there and like I didn't find out till later, but they had me on a different floor than the other guests. Like the guests were up in like their own little green room areas, and I was separate. So they had like coffee and bagels and all that. And I had nothing. They weren't communicating with me. I was there for a couple hours, and I was like, "Am I just not going to be brought on the show?" And it was a concern because I remember I think it was James Lindsay who was on the Dr. Phil show, and they brought him out towards the end and just sandbagged him. So the whole time I'm thinking that's going to happen, and they're like, "Oh no, we filmed a different episode first, and now we're going to film your episode." And I had told them, like, you see, every time you see me, I'm wearing a hat like this or some similar hat. And I told them I do that all the time while I was on the phone with them, pre-recording, pre-agreeing to do it. And I wear ridiculous shoes. I understand that, but I wear Vibram 5-finger shoes. And I'm like, I've been wearing these for 11 years. Like, if that's a problem, just let me know. And they're like, no, it's fine. And then I get there and they tell me I can't wear the hat because of lighting and I can't wear the shoes because they never even gave me a reason for that. And they were like going through my wardrobe and trying to make me wear clothes that they had as opposed to, I had like 4 suits with me as opposed to clothes that I had. And it was just really awkward. Like it felt like they were, I don't want to describe malice to it, but it felt like they were trying to make me uncomfortable. So like I look on that show because I would have done, the way I do my hair is different than how they did it. Like I don't feel like I look like myself. It's really awkward to me. And so they bring me out and I was again told it was going to be 3-on-3. And instead, it ended up being 4-on-2. It was myself and Bob Woodson, who's a civil rights activist who's against reparations. And then they have the lady who I mentioned, whose family history was entwined with slavery, and the anti-racism girl. And then they had a guy who had run to be mayor of city council, who was just basically there to milady that side of the argument, because that's a way to say. And they had another guy over Zoom. And I wanted, when they weren't telling me what was going on, I wanted to walk. I called my wife. I was like, listen, I think I just want to bail. And she was like, yeah, go ahead, just bail. I don't care. Like, you're right, bail. And then I stayed anyways. They filmed the episode. We recorded for like an hour or so. And then that was back in October. Skip ahead, it airs in April. And it was just 6 months of stress of not knowing how it was going to be cut and framed, because they did cut a lot of it. Like they cut a lot of what we talked about. And so, yeah, that's basically how that came to pass though.
So you were told, like you mentioned, that it was going to be 3-on-3. Do you know who the other person was going to be, or did they not give you any list of names?
No, I don't think they had a third person. I think they were trying to find a third person is what it was, because that was probably a couple weeks before the actual filming date. So I think their original plan was to just be 3-on-3, and from what I've learned, different producers on different episodes frame them different ways. They set up the narratives or how they want the conversation to go different ways. And I don't think the person that was producing my episode had the same view as Dr. Phil did, because it didn't play out the way that I was at least told. And I think initially they did want a 3-on-3 debate, and then it just they just couldn't find a third person. Not many people, I guess, what's the delicate way of saying this? If you're one of the melanated peoples, as some people in the libertarian world like to call them, I won't name check who, you can get away with saying you're against reparations without being just directly called a racist. And a lot of people know that. So it's kind of hard to want to come out against that issue or many social issues without just knowing the backlash is coming. I didn't care, so I was fine with doing that, because if they're going to call you racist, they're going to call you racist. Kind of who cares? But right. I don't think they could find anybody else who wanted to be on the show. And that's why it wasn't 3-on-3. I don't think they wanted it to just be 2-on-2, because then it's harder to cut it up. Like the more people you have talking, the more you can cut around people. But if you just have 2-on-2, it becomes a lot harder to cut it. So it ended up, like I said, it ended up being 4-on-2, which was really unfair. The mayoral candidate should have just been cut. There was no reason for him to be there. And it just, it felt stacked. And I don't necessarily know why.
So, I mean, maybe just, I don't know how producers are picked and chosen on what episode they're going to be doing that time or whatever, because like you're saying, and from my knowledge of television, especially something like Dr. Phil or anything that's similar to that, they do film different episodes on the same day. Like, okay, we have today's Thursday, we're going to be filming 3 episodes today, and then the next day we're doing whatever. And then like each producer, or how many producers there are, they assign, okay, you're going to be doing this one, you're going to be doing this one and this one. And then who knows, maybe one of the producers that wasn't assigned to you, maybe they were more on your side. So maybe if they were assigned to you, maybe they would have tried to at least had the facade of a fair shot or some kind of fair debate or whatever.
Right. That's why I don't really want to ascribe. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of malice to ascribe to Hollywood as an industry, but I didn't really want to ascribe malice to the producers simply because when I talked to them, they were very congenial. Like we were able to have a conversation. I was able to tell them like, here's the numbers, here's the math, here's what I know, here's what I believe, and they were all fine with that. There was no hostility at all, and they could have just been put on a facade, but it felt sincere for the most part. And producers could have changed. I mean, a show could have moved hands to a different producer, or it could have been edited differently. So who knows? But it felt like they went into it wanting to do one thing, the 3-on-3 debate. That didn't happen. They changed the narrative shift because, again, originally it was just supposed to be I was the guy that was against reparations. And because they didn't know my history with my family. So they went, oh, that's a thing. And they changed the premise of the show to bring that into it. And then ended up downplaying almost all of that. Like, I don't think I talked about Orson Murray really at all, except for in the intro when they cut it in. And that was sort of my animosity. I don't know how much of this I can talk about because of NDA stuff, but well, let them sue me. When was the first time somebody sued me? So the lady they interviewed two of us. There were 6 of us on the panel. They only interviewed 2 of us that I know of. They interviewed myself and the lady whose family was both slave and slave owner. And they flew her in because she lives back down south. They flew her in. You watch her interview. When they introduce her, it is a professionally shot, professionally edited. They flew her into interview. I'm an hour from the studio. Like I drove myself to that studio, and they had me do it over Zoom in the room I'm in now. I didn't have the green screen or anything else, and they made me take everything off my wall 5 minutes before we were shooting. Like, oh no, you can't do that. I had these headphones on because I can hear you with these headphones. They're like, oh, you can't wear those. Do you have AirPods or something smaller? Like everything was being changed, and they were trying to get specific answers out of me. And as you know, because I've been talked to you a few times, I talk a lot. So they're like, so do you think that reparations should be allowed? And I give them a very qualified statement because I was like, I know what you're trying to do here. Like, I know you're trying to get that clip, and I'm not going to give it to you. So they had to really tweak what I said, but they did some voiceover with it because they made me shoot my own video. So if you see the intro, you'll see, I don't know which one they use because there's one where I'm sitting on a chair, one where I'm outside in my backyard, and one that I'm on my couch. Like I had to shoot all those myself. Like I had to figure out how to shoot those myself to send them promo clip stuff of myself. Whereas I'm an hour away. I could have driven to them at any time.
Yeah.
And they flew somebody else in to do that stuff for her. I think they flew somebody out there to film for her also, because there's a whole thing of her being filmed, like paddling her boat or a little canoe out on the water of her property. And I was like, it just felt really dishonest. You know, it felt really.
It's like it's like one of those where they have someone like walking, just looking off to the side. You know, oh, yeah, and this person's doing this, and no, yeah, like that kind of thing.
I felt like it was worse than that. It felt like there's Reason TV sometime back did a video clip. They do all like the joke video things. They did a video of campaigns. Like, look at our candidate. Look at the flags and the lens flare in the background. Look at their candidate. Quick cuts and mean voiceovers. Our candidate's holding a baby. Their candidate doesn't have a baby. Like that's what it felt like. Like, look at how beautiful of a life she has. Look at how wonderful she is. Look at how great she's lit. Yeah, light yourself in your house. Like. Okay.
I mean, this is like completely, I don't know how this will be taken, but the fact that they were kind of, I guess, grooming her, not in a weird way or whatever,
right.
but like, you know, trying to like make her, like you're saying, make her seem this, oh, she has an amazing life, whatever. It's almost like they're saying, maybe not intentionally, but it's like, okay, so you're for reparations, but you're living this great life. I don't think you need them. Like, you don't need this money. You're doing great.
It was super surreal because it's like, you know, my family, like my ancestor, he had multiple kids. And so the property was split up amongst them. And then that guy's kids, you know, that sort of thing back in the 1800s. And you're looking at this chick and you're like, your family has like hundreds of acres of property or whatever. And then everyone I've talked to who's watched the episode, when they talk about her, they're like, she like lights up when they say $14 trillion. And it's like, ooh, like all of a sudden it's this thing. And it just oozes greed. And it didn't send the message I think they wanted it to send. You know, it was a really weird contrast. You're like, wait, the person you're putting up for reparations doesn't seem like they need it in any capacity. Like she could sell a few acres of property to rehab other parts of it or whatever. And it's like, but we're going to we're gonna push your story as though it's the poor. Like you could see it like it was some poor downtrodden person whose
Right,
family had
yeah.
everything stolen from them or whatever. But it's like, here's a lady whose ancestor enslaved her other ancestors and gave them thousands of dollars worth of property to this day. It's like literally generational wealth. Like her family literally had generational wealth, and she's begging for reparations, which is a weird narrative to be pushing with that.
And it's like $14 trillion or whatever that massive amount would be. If it's gonna be split, I mean, okay, first of all, like I guess you're gonna have to count how many people are black or whatever, however many of the bad people, like I don't know, millions, right? In America, and you gotta split that up. I don't know if she knows the math or anything like that, but okay.
There is no math because it's all predicated on like this certain, we're going to put this much towards infrastructure and this much towards education, all this convoluted thing. Like I asked, because they didn't delineate it to begin with. And I said, well, what does it mean to be black? Because like, if I go through my ancestry, like we have a black ancestor somewhere. We haven't from Africa. We haven't figured out where it came in, but it's like 9 generations back. And they're like, well, you'd have to identify as black over the last 12 years on your government issue IDs. And I'm like, well, that's a thing. Like, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, I mean, there's a whole bunch of nuance with the issue. Like you can dive into all these different things about how it all works and how it doesn't, but they don't care. It's mostly just feels like a grift, and and it's a contentious issue where most of the comments are people just screaming at each other about it. I think the frustrating part is that a lot of what was said, like the things I was actually worried about, never even made it to air. Like I spent 6 months stressing out about what was going to be on the show and over a couple certain things, and they never made it to air, and it just confused me. And it was like, oh, okay.
Well, so I guess we can go ahead and watch, because you were talking about how you had to film all these different promos and whatever they're going to use, and so we'll just kind of watch your intro here, because like I did see the intro, and like you were saying, you're literally like in front of a freaking wall.
The wall behind me.
Yeah, it's crazy how different it is. But anyway, this is for anyone who's just listening. This is his appearance on the Dr. Phil show. His last season, I believe it's going to be ending production after this season.
Correct.
So kudos to that, Josh. You just made it. But anyway,
I killed the Dr. Phil show.
Yeah, it's all your fault. All right.
Now, my next guest says Black Americans should not be awarded reparations because the issue is fraught with complications and questions.
My fifth great grandfather, Orson Smith Murray, was an abolitionist from the 1830s until after the Civil War. He was known to have said that slavery was the struggle of the hour at the time. That was the big issue in our country. Learning about my fifth great grandfather also kept my interest in social and political issues. When it comes to reparations for American slavery, I think morally it may be a good idea, but practically it's not. Reparations for slavery were a good thing 150 years ago. I think today they're not being used in any sort of good way. It's not well thought out. Who's going to pay for it? It's going to be future taxpayers. If you really wanted to help the Black community, you wouldn't just want to write to the Black community. You'd want to solve the problems with absent fatherhood or the broken education system in those communities. I've never seen a plan put down that would work rationally, ethically, or morally.
Yeah, see, that's what I'm talking about now. But it's go and it's just your selfie. You have like your face like, and I don't know. It's just
so I hadn't watched that yet because I've been sort of avoiding the episode. So it's interesting because those answers that you see me give, every one of those answers was given multiple times. Like that wasn't like I gave a speech or they asked me a question. Like they would ask me a question and I would answer it. And they would make me re-answer it 2 or 3 times so they thought they had something they could.
So that was like take 3 of 5 or something like that.
Every one of those, like the where you see the white wall behind me. So everything else was just no sound, no nothing, just video that they just used. Like the book I'm holding is a collection of newspapers from Orson Murray's newspaper back in the 1850s. And so those were just videos they asked me to shoot. They had me shoot something. And they're like, do you have any selfies or whatever? So I sent them a handful of pictures and they chose those 2 to use, which is interesting. One of them's from Politicon several years ago, which is just hilarious. But those, when you see me answering the questions on the couch, they made me answer all of those questions, not just 2 or 3 times, like 5 or 6 times sometimes. And until they thought they had something they could use. So it's not it doesn't feel like it was an honest interview or honest conversation. So it's jarring to see it.
Yeah, and then you're talking about the recording of promos. Was it just that one that they were showing where you're on your computer? It looks like you're outside. What were the other ones that you had done?
So I had done one where, so there's one that I was sitting on the couch reading something. I don't know what I was doing at the time. I had one out in my backyard where I was on my computer, and then one on a chair that's over here in my office that I had. That's where I'm reading the newspaper. So I think I sent them 3 or 4 different video clips because they'd asked me, "Oh, do you have this? Do you have that?" I'm like, "No."
Why would I record myself reading the newspaper?
Right. I'm not an Insta model. Like, I'm not like, oh, here I am, in a poppy field with my favorite novel. Like, what the fuck is this? So it was just bizarre, And again, nothing that they couldn't have filmed. I mean, I can drive there. If I drive there legally, I could get there in about an hour or so in traffic. If I drive there expeditiously, 35 minutes. So it's just like, whatever.
Like you're swerving and speeding. I gotta get there. Like in
the 5 stars, Grand Theft Auto style.
Yeah, there you go. All right.
So, okay, go ahead.
I was just gonna say we can watch when Mr. Phil McGraw. Oh, sorry, it's Dr. Phil McGraw. Excuse me. I gotta give him the proper title. When he asks you about all the should we allow? Anyway, I'll let Phil ask.
I'd like to now introduce political writer and consultant Joshua Ferguson, and also Alex Gruenfelder, who ran for Los Angeles mayor this past year. While he didn't make it past the primaries, he has now joined Karen Bass's team as the head of her youth engagement department. So welcome to both of you. Appreciate you joining the conversation.
I feel like with his intro, that guy's intro, they could have just cut out the part where he was like, yeah, he didn't make it. It's like, oh, you could have just been like, he ran for mayor. Okay, great. He didn't win, obviously, but he just ran for mayor. And then he's that youth engagement person or whatever.
So keep in mind, before they walked me out on stage, as I was walking in, I was told that I was going to be introduced by myself related to my family history as the lady before me had been introduced. So I was blindsided by this other guy being on the episode entirely, let alone being introduced with me.
Like, so it would have made more sense if you and that other lady were introduced at the same time, if they were going to go that angle, because she has this angle and you have this angle, and they're very similar in some ways.
That's where it got jarring, because like I said, even as I was walking towards the stage from the green room, that's what I was told. It was going to be her introduction, her story, my introduction, my story. Then the rest of the panel would be brought on. So when they introduced me with this other guy, it was jarring. And then, because I was told not 5 minutes before, hey, this is how we're going to introduce you, and this is what they're going to ask. And then none of that happened. So if I were to ascribe malice to it, I would say they did that to throw me off my game, to prepare me to have an answer ready and then not let me answer that.
Joshua, let me start with you. You say that this is a really complicated issue and that trying to do this now is just fraught with so many problems that it's undoable.
Yes. You have to define terms that people don't want to define. What does it mean to be black? What do we mean by reparations? What will it be used for? To find out who would qualify would almost put us into a dystopia of classes against each other, trying to divide us up as opposed to trying to unite us with any sort of goal. So I think there are more complications and problems than there are solutions.
Do you say it shouldn't be done because it's too complex to come up with an answer, or because there has been inequities that are still having an effect? You just don't know how to level the playing field? What's your...
You can't level playing fields. That never works in human history. The big problem is that when you look at a situation that's as long as it is, I mean, as people talk about it, they talk about the United States' history of slavery. There was slavery in what is now the United States longer than we've been a country. It's like 260 years of slavery under Spanish rule in Florida, 230 years of America. How do you blame America for things that predate America? I mean, we have these problems where you have to define what does it mean to be black. You know, doing my own ancestry, we have through my father, it's like 2% Congolese DNA. I have no idea where that comes from. I can tell you it's 7 or 8 generations back, and my family was here in the country at that time. So am I black? I mean, it becomes a very complex issue.
Alex, how do you respond to this?
I think that really when we
That was such a blatant cut there. Like this, I don't know if you heard the audio, just like
Right.
Yeah.
They cut there, and again, it was an issue where I felt blindsided by it, because that's not what I was told I was going to be brought on to talk about. And then I had to just sort of like, oh, hold on, let me, and then he asked the question again the same way. Like I said, we can't qualify this, and then he wants a bit of more bitey answer, or more soundbitey answer. So he asked it the same question again a different way, and then moves on. And it was, they did cut. I don't even remember what I said at that point, but they did cut something there.
So, I mean, we don't have to get into this guy's answer. I mean, it's not really relevant to your specific experience, but do you remember any of the things that you did say that was cut? Do you remember any of that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So when the anti-racist lady was talking, the other TikTok guest was talking, she brought up George Floyd, and she brought up systemic racism. And I'm not from, but I live in the city of Fullerton, and many years ago, but over a decade ago, we had a homeless guy named Kelly Thomas who the police beat to death. And I brought him up, and I said, well, you look at George Floyd and something like that, and you see systemic racism. And I look at a system of the haves versus the have-nots, where it's like, in my town, Kelly Thomas was beaten to death by 5 police officers. The primary one was a Hispanic officer named Ramos. How do you square that with systemic racism? So it's an issue of the police. And what I said at that point was, if you look back at like what the law enforcement against prohibition had said years ago, there's a reason why the police go after people in Compton or Linwood or what have you, as opposed to Hollywood. I think what I said was, let me see if I remember how I phrased this. On Oscar night, there is so much cocaine that you might think it's snowing, but the cops never bust anybody because everyone in Hollywood has the mayor's number. And I looked over, I said, sorry, Dr. Phil, I don't mean to imply that you're a coke addict, but no, I'm not saying it applies to you, but nobody gets busted in this town, but they make all their arrests in areas where people can't defend themselves. That's not an issue of racism. That's an issue of classism. That's an issue of oligarchy. So I made that point, and it was completely excised from the episode. And then, what was that?
I was just gonna say, did you wait for a laugh break when you said that? But Dr. Phil?
Dr. Phil laughed. He straight laughed at that. He laughed at that. The audience laughed at that, and I was like, I wonder if they'll air that. Like, that was the one bit I was like, I wonder if they'll air it. It was funny. Like, maybe it'll play. Yeah. And they cut the entire section on that. Yeah. And then there was another moment where in that moment when I was making my point, the lady, the anti-racist girl, lady, so I don't mean to besmirch her. She cut me off, and I went, whoa, hold on, let me finish my point. And I was so worried about that because if they cut that a certain way, it could be seen as me just trying to silence this, strong, independent Black woman. That's like sort of what I was worried about. Like, crap, they're gonna cut that to make it look like I'm trying to shut her down or silence her when she was cutting me off. And then the professor that was over Skype or Zoom or whatever, he was remote, he kept interrupting me. And there was a point where like I'd try to get a thing out, and he would, or try to get a point out, and he would interrupt me. And I was like, "Are you going to let me finish my point?" And Dr. Phil said, "Well, one of you finish your point," as though it was my fault. And it was also weird because he would ask if we had opinions, and I could see the teleprompter to my left, and I could see what he had in his notes because I was sitting right next to him. And almost every time it said to cut to me, they didn't. So he would ask, and he would say, like, and was anybody like, he would ask a question or somebody would make a comment, and I would be like, hey, can I say something here? And he like, and okay, when we come back from the bumper, the break or whatever, and then they'd never come back to me. And so it was, or not never, but rarely would they come back. It was just like, even when the screen said cut to this person, ask this person, do this, he would just skip me. And it was bizarre.
Yeah. And I think in the finished episode, I believe after that, the intro and then your opening statement or whatever you want to call it, I think you only had maybe one other time that you spoke in that episode out of however many times you got to speak on there.
I would say during the actual recording, the big clip that sort of went viral from that episode was Bob Woodson talking about Black men no longer being in the household and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. He gave that little speech. I just sat there and let it cool. You pick up this ball, you run with it. That's awesome. Less I have to talk about. I spoke more than he did on that episode. I probably spoke more than anybody else on that episode and responded more. And yet I'm cut from most of it. So I don't know that I just didn't give them the narrative they wanted. I mean, after the episode, several people on the crew were like, hey, you did a good job. Like, I don't know if there used to be this group called Friends of Abe in Hollywood of like conservatives that were secret conservatives in Hollywood. I don't know if they were like those type of people, but they were like, you did a good job. You made some good points. And then yet none of those points make it into the show. Like when even the crew is like, good job. Can't wait to cut it. You know?
Yeah, it's a lot of the background, a lot of the crew that are like in the dark. Those are the ones like, oh man, he did a good job. Everyone else in the front are like, no, he sucked. We need to edit all that shit out. What are you talking about?
Gone.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was jarring though to even watching that. It's not, like I said, it's hard for me to watch that because I'm like, okay, I don't have my hat on, and that's fine. I don't always wear my hat. I take it off, obviously, but the shoes bothers me so much. There are only 2 times in the last, and this isn't like an ego thing or what have you, it's just an aesthetic thing. Like there are only 2 times since 2010 that I haven't worn the same style shoes just from a comfort standpoint. And that was my wedding day because they didn't make nice enough looking ones at the time. And now the Dr. Phil episode. The only times that I've not worn. And I think, and technically one time when I was helping a shoot an independent film and I was the villain, I had some work boots on because it was just safer. So yeah, it was like,
it fit the character.
It fit the character. I was doing my due diligence, but yeah, they forced me out of my shoes, which again just felt like a flex to make me uncomfortable. Not that it was, but it felt like it.
Yeah.
So,
but it's weird that they would have you not wear those shoes because I mean, no one's gonna be focusing on anyone's shoes. I mean, maybe they're, oh man, this guy's shoes are so. I don't know. It's crazy. I've never seen shoes like this. Everyone's gonna be like, "Whoa, look at that guy's shoes."
Okay, so here I'll give you. I'll do it. Like these are the ones I normally wear. Right? They stand out. They have red soles. I have ones that are all black. You couldn't tell. You wouldn't. Nobody in the audience that was there, unless they were in the first or second row, would have known. So I didn't feel like there was a reason to do that, and yet they did anyways. And like I said, I don't want to ascribe malice to it generally, but what it felt like, living my truth. What it felt like was they were trying to make me uncomfortable. And so again, I'll go out there. You're going to be able to answer this question, and this is where we're going to frame it. And then, by the way, you can't wear something you're used to. You can't be comfortable. We're going to change the setup. We're going to change the framing mechanism. We're going to change the way the guests are showing up. We're going to ask you the question and then ask you the question again. So even though I had my answer, now I had to come up with another answer on the spot. I'm like, okay, now what? And so, yeah, it was 6 months of stress before it finally aired, and then they cut most of it. So it was 6 months of stress for nothing.
And, according to your experience, that you're saying that you were probably the one that spoke the most out of the whole panel. We would say so, right? You would say that you probably spoke. But then in the finished product, in the episode that aired, like I said, you spoke maybe like 2 or 3 times or whatever. And it kind of made you look like you didn't really know what you were talking about, almost like you were like a chump, because that one lady got to speak all the time. It seemed like, oh yeah, I'm gonna put my point across, like da, 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 da. And then you're just kind of sitting there like, yeah, well, I guess I'll just take what she's saying, even though you said that, well, I did actually respond to a lot of what these people were saying, but the way that it aired made you look like you didn't know what to say or something like that.
Right. And so it's an issue of being wary of interview requests or being wary of going on podcasts. So because of my TikTok stuff, because of, I don't have a huge following on there. It's like, I think it just hit 63,000 followers, and I've had some videos get 500,000 views or whatever, but it's a weird algorithm, a weird monster. There's no logic to it. But because of that, I've had people reach out to me to do podcasts or like the Dr. Phil show. And it really is a lesson in having control over how things are presented or knowing how they're presented. And I think it's also one of the reasons why podcasts became so popular, because if you watch 3 hours of Joe Rogan or Tim Pool, you're watching 3 hours of Joe Rogan or Tim Pool. Like you're watching the conversation as it's happening, and they aren't just slicing it up to make it fit a narrative or fit a story or fit a timeline or whatever they're doing. And so it doesn't feel honest to watch those shows or to be on those shows, especially having been on one now and going, oh, like I don't get me wrong. I wasn't naive. I knew this. I live close enough to LA that I have been a guest on several talk shows over the years because nonprofit groups use us as fundraisers pretty regularly because they'll pay you like $10 a head to be a guest if you bring like 30 or 40 people. So I've been a guest in the audience on shows over the years a couple times, and you watch the episodes live as they're being recorded, and then months later it airs, and you're like, that's not what was said, or that was cut, or that was interesting, if you remember it, because they'll have you film a couple episodes at a time as an audience. So I wasn't naive to it, but I still let myself sort of get steamrolled by it by going into something where I knew I had no editorial control. Like if I had asked for editorial control, they never would have had me on. They just wouldn't have allowed it. That's the power they have. They're like, we have millions of viewers. If you want to be on TV, if you want your 15 seconds of fame, then you're going to play by our rules. And there isn't much of a value proposition for most people, unless you're the, catch me outside girl.
Right.
Right. There isn't much of a value proposition because it doesn't necessarily lend itself to something else. If I was going to say, like, of the shows I've been asked to go on, I'll come on here because I know it's just a conversation between you, myself, and your tenant, and I know it's just a conversation, right? Like I know where it's going to go. Like if I was going to be on a show, something like Part of the Problem or Rogan or something like that, it's just a conversation. It's going to, even if it gets contentious or something happens or somebody walks out or whatever, it's just a conversation and it's not going to be deceptively edited. Whereas everything on TV is. And I knew, again, that's why I should have walked, because I knew that many years ago, I was a moderator on this political website. This is early 2000s, like 2002, 2003. And we were asked to be on the guy who owned the site was asked to be on Anderson 360 it was CNN back in the day. And he didn't want to do it. He wanted nothing to do with it. And I was the person who admined the message board. And so he asked if I would do it. And I was like, yeah, cool, whatever. And they wanted somebody to be, because I was, libertarian, more conservative than leftist. And they wanted somebody on that side of the political issue, on the anti-war issue. And our whole sort of shtick on our website was pointing out the hypocrisy of Hollywood, where it was like, these people say one thing when one person's president and something else when someone else is president, and they're hypocrites, and, it's hierarchy, not hypocrisy or whatever. But we were talking about those issues, and they interviewed me sort of pre-interview, and then never had me on. Like they just stopped talking to me after they had their sort of pre-interview. And then they had a competing website's people on who gave them exactly what they wanted. And they were all sort of far right, herder, dumb lefty. And that's exactly what Anderson Cooper wanted on his show. He wanted people that he could just lampoon or like, look at the dumb people that disagree with us. And I didn't give them that. So they just didn't have me on the show. And again, that's 20 years ago. Like I knew this stuff. I'm not naive to it, but it is a recurring important lesson that most of what you see in media, unless it's long form, unedited, what have you, is probably just there to fit a message, fit a narrative, push an agenda, what have you.
Well, also, when you're talking about how you're doing a pre-interview and they're trying to see if you're going to give them what they wanted, and then you ended up not giving them, oh, well, screw this guy, I'm going to go somewhere else. I mean, you're probably just being nuanced. And like you're saying, they wanted someone who was just completely, oh, this guy is completely a whack job, or however they're going to describe them. But you were kind of like, well, I mean, it is this way, but actually this is also pretty bad. And and they're like, no, we don't want our people to look bad. We want those people to look bad. So we're going to go to these people who give us what we want, because it'll make us look good, and the television episode will be awesome, and the Anderson Cooper will look smart.
People get mad in the comments. And I think that's actually what happened with the Dr. Phil episode. Because when I was on the phone with the producers, I was just rattling off statistics and just like one of the things I think I said on the phone, I was like, one of the problems with reparations is that people don't want to really discuss is that we talk about, racism and what have you in America, but 1 in 5 Black people in America today are here. They're either first or second generation, and generation demarks about 25 years. So 1 in 5 Black people in America came here since, say, the 60s, like post civil rights movement. You're like, well, how do you qualify a system as inherently racist and systemically racist when 1 in 5 people who are allegedly oppressed chose their oppression? Like that's a really hard disconnect to figure out. And there's all sorts of other things. I was bringing those things up, and I think that's what they wanted. Like they expect me to come out with those things, or to say something that was, flamboyantly, problematic that they could then pounce on. And I gave them none of that during the filming. Like, it was way more nuanced and way more just, instead of attacking, I was just responding to what they were saying. Like, they would say something and I would try to, take it down and be like, that's not true. And here's why, which is less useful when you're trying to do that on TV. So, not that everything I said was smart. I probably said some dumb stuff that needed to be cut also, but nothing that was, useful.
Well, I think if they're gonna say that they're gonna present this question and they want different opinions, like, I mean, Dr. Phil says at the end, well, I'm glad we had this really nice discussion and this really really open and honest conversation. I really appreciate you guys being here. But then you see the finished product and you're like, that wasn't open. What are you talking about? Because like, he could say that. And I mean, Dr. Phil did say something that was interesting, where he said, and I don't really know exactly where his opinion is on this. Maybe he is kind of balanced. Maybe, I don't know, but I'm not really sure. But he says something like, well, there are a lot of social programs that do, quote unquote, benefit minorities, to like education and infrastructure and all this stuff. And I'm thinking, okay, that's an interesting point. Bring that up. But then, okay, you're going to have that brought up, but then you're just going to cut everything that Josh says because, it didn't fit what we wanted. I mean, I get it. You want to fit however many minutes you need, like 45 minutes or whatever. So, and you film, it's like an hour and a half. Okay, we gotta cut out like 45 minutes of this to make it fit that hour with the ads, whatever. But still, it's just, it's like you were saying, it's not what they were promising you or presenting you as what this episode was going to be, to where it was originally going to be one thing to,
Even afterwards, they have you go backstage and you like take a picture in front of the backdrop of the Dr. Phil show or whatever. And he's like, "Oh, it was a great discussion, and we should have you back. We'll do this again sometime." I'm like, "No, you won't.
Have you back? Your show is ending at the." What are you
we didn't know
about?
that. Nobody knew that at the time. So this is back in October.
Okay.
That wasn't announced.
That's right. You're right.
Yeah, that wasn't announced until a couple months ago. But it was like, "We'll have you back at some." I'm like, "No, you won't." Like, even then, I'm like, "That's not true. You're not having me back." And again, what really got under my skin, when we're leaving, they take us all back to the green rooms, and I drove myself, and everyone else like got shuttles or cars or whatever. And so they're taking us back to the green room, and they take us upstairs in this area that I hadn't been yet. Like, this is after the airing, right? I'm going upstairs, and I look over, and there's a coffee station, and there's like bagels and all this stuff. And I'm like, I didn't get access to any of this. And I see all the rooms that they're all in, like all of the other guests were on this floor. And they're like, "Oh no, you're over here." And then we go downstairs, like behind this little like walkway. Like, I felt like I was like Harry Potter being pushed under the stairs, and it was like, what the hell? Like, why didn't I get the bagels? What, like, you've been watching me drink coffee this whole time. Like, I'm the one who needed coffee of all of them. If I'd known that was there, I would have gone upstairs and just stolen the pot of coffee. And it felt even more disingenuous, like when they took me back to the green room afterwards, because it was like, oh, you really did treat me entirely differently than every other guest that was on this show. Wow.
What about Mr. Woodson?
He was up there. He was upstairs with them as well, I think, because he was outside because they made you do all the, make sure you didn't have COVID and whatnot at the time back in October.
Right.
And so I was just sitting outside of this little coffee type area that's out sort of like eating the patio that they have for the cafe and on the lot. And I'm sitting there, and he and his handlers showed up, and they were sitting near me, and they didn't acknowledge my existence at all. And I was like, "Oh, hey, we're on the same episode." And they were like, "Oh," they didn't care that I existed at all. And then I never saw him again until they brought him out, which meant, and I looked down the hall a few times trying to get a hold of people because they make you sign an NDA and all this stuff. And I was the only, again, when they took us backstage again, they took him upstairs and took me around. So it wasn't like an ideological split. They literally had me segregated from everybody else. And I don't know that it was, again, I don't know that it was intentional, but it felt like it after the fact.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't get the cool stuff. Oh, I didn't get to, like, it seemed like they had talked beforehand also. Like, they had like I don't know if they had their own green room or whatever, but they were like, "Oh, it's so good to meet you." And it's like the two black girls that were there were like, "Oh, it's so good to meet you and talk to you and blah, 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 blah." And I'm like, I didn't get to meet or talk to anybody before this happened. Like, what is going on here? Yeah. So after the filming, I actually felt way worse than I did beforehand. And then it was 6 months of let's see what happens. And now we've seen what happens. I killed the Dr. Phil show.
It was like you were a visiting team visiting another sport, like another team stadium, and okay, you're going to go into shitty visiting while the home team gets the nice lockers and all that good stuff.
Right. That was the back in the day before Angel Stadium was built. The Angels used to be, right, back in '63. They were the Los Angeles Angels, and they played at Dodger Stadium, and they used different locker rooms than the Dodgers did. They weren't allowed to use the same locker room, so that's what it felt like. I'm like, no, you're the second tier. You're not as valuable as the other players, so you need to be over there and do your own thing. And it's like, oh, okay, I guess.
So if other offers came about to where, hey, we want you to come on our show and talk about such and such topic, what are kind of like, do you have, after this experience for sure, do you have that, well, if this doesn't happen, I'm not doing it? Or like, I have a set of, you're going to be that person. Well, this has to happen. And I got to have it in writing.
Yeah. If I don't have all of the brown M&Ms pulled out of my M&Ms, I am not going on your show. I don't know that I would do a lot of other shows if I didn't feel like I could trust them. So, if you had just an array of shows that you got requests from, you go, do I think this person has a good enough reputation that they wouldn't try to sandbag me? Is this meant to be an honest conversation? Is it meant to be due diligence? Like, excuse me, I would probably do, not that I would ever be asked, but I would absolutely do something like whatever show Greg Gutfeld has, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't feel like he would intentionally try to sandbag me. I think he would just cut around things just for time or what have you. Right. But those conversations also feel like they're straight up conversations. They don't feel like they're narratively manipulated. I don't think I'd have a problem with somebody like a Bill Maher, who again may disagree with you, but will let the whole conversation happen, because unless it just runs too long, he'll let the whole conversation happen, because that's what the whole point of the conversation is, the conversation. Right. But a lot of shows like daytime TV, probably never again, unless there's specific value. Like, unless they were going to say, hey, we'll let you know how it's going to be edited, or we'll tell you what's going to happen. And I think that's what happens in a lot of politics also. You always see these things about how politicians have the softball questions, so they know what the questions are going to be. We just saw this with Biden like a week or two ago, where he had not just the reporter's picture, but the question they were going to ask.
Right. Yeah.
And you kind of have to understand that, simply because you don't know what their agenda is. You don't know what their point is. Or they're going to ask you something that's just completely off the wall in order to throw you off and make you look bad or what have you. So I would say, if anybody was going to do somebody's podcast or show, look at the output first. I did that. That's what sort of suckered me on the Dr. Phil show, was I had seen James Lindsay had been on there, and I think, I can't think of her name right now.
Sydney Watson.
Yeah, thank you. Sydney Watson. Well, her episode hadn't aired yet, but she was on there. But Lindsay's episode had aired, and they had sandbagged him, and I was like, ooh, that looks bad. But the preceding dozen or two episodes before mine filmed, not before mine aired, before mine filmed, were just conversations. And it was like 5-on-5 or 6-on-6 or whatever. And it seemed like they let people talk and get their points across, and it went back and forth, and it seemed really organic to a point. And then that was like what I tricked myself into believing it was going to be. And I was like, oh, okay, that was a decent conversation. I could handle that. And then that's just not what it ended up being. So that's where it becomes an issue. You'd have to really have an idea of what the output is, who the producer is, make sure it's the same producer, because different producers, different episodes. I would ask, like, what other episodes have you produced? How do I know it's going to be like this, or what have you? But if you want to be on those shows, you have no control unless you're a name person. Like, if you're a name brand person, there's a reason why guys like Ben Shapiro or what have you probably aren't going to ever be on a show like the Dr. Phil show anymore, because his brand is too high that he can get in front of that stuff. He can be like, listen, I'm not going to do this where you're going to sandbag me. It's not going to happen. So you pick and choose where you're going to be on. And I feel like most people have to do that. It doesn't matter how big the show is. Like, again, it could be a small show. It could be something like what I do. It could be something as big as Rogan. You just have to know that you're going on a show where somebody's honest with what their intent is, and that's difficult. I've been asked, like I said, I've been asked to do a few podcasts or what have you, and I'll look at the content and I'm like, they're just trying to make me say something stupid. Or you look at the content and you're like, this show is going to get me heated because they say so much off, out of pocket stuff or what have you. And so you got to weigh the pros and cons of it. I don't think daytime TV, after being on Dr. Phil show, I don't think there's any pros for people, unless you're trying to get I don't know, middle-aged women to yell at you on the internet.
Yeah, and I mean, daytime television is unless you're a soap opera. I mean, you're pretty much like the viewership is way down. I mean, I know like Dr. Phil was still doing okay for a daytime talk show. I think it was getting like at least a couple million every episode. So I mean, he's doing okay. But of course, now the show is ending, and so now you have I don't know what's the iteration now of that Kelly Ripa show? You know, however many there are for that.
Right,
You know,
right.
like you're gonna go on that and think that Kelly Ripa is gonna ask you, oh, she might ask me some interesting, smart questions. Yeah, yeah. And whoever the person is gonna be sitting next to her, I think it's her husband now, I think, or whatever it was. But it's just like, yeah, I don't know.
Right. And it's also that issue where you're like, I felt like Dr. Phil, I don't get me wrong, I know the history and I know the drama backstage, some of the drama stuff and whatnot, but it was like, okay, it felt like they were going to have an honest conversation, which kind of happened, but wasn't what was edited. But there's a lot of shows that during that time frame where even prime time, you go on that, like, I would never go on The View. Like, why? Like, if my profile was high enough to be asked to be on that show, I would just say no. And you're like, no, there are other shows that are so much better that have such lower viewership. I would go on those first. Like I would never, there is no value add to go on there, you know, even if Tucker Carlson is their newest host, you know.
Oh man, if Tucker was, oh gosh, and then The View would actually get a lot of viewers for that, just to see the showdowns between him and Joy Behar. That'd be
right.
Awesome.
But that's the thing. Could you imagine being on that show? Like you just have to,
you wouldn't even get a word in.
Right. It's just common decency. We're like, there's no intrinsic value. I would never go on the Young Turks. Like, I don't feel like you'd have an honest conversation with them. I feel like you'd be shouted down. They'd edit it out of context. They'd pull clips that were manipulated in order to make you look stupid. Like, there's no value add to it. Whereas Joe Rogan pulls the clips, even Tim Pool, I think to a point, pulls the clips that make his show look interesting. It's not just like, oh, own the libs or own the opposition. It's like, this clip is going to blow up, or this is going to be viral, or this is just a really fire point. Like, that's what's pulled. It's meant to promote the product as opposed to just dunk on people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big difference. You know, I think in the sphere that we sort of circle around, I would say probably Dave Smith is probably the closest, maybe Tom Woods. There's a few others where you're like, okay, they have honest intentions. That'd be worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, like, I know that, like, for example, I know Dave has had some people on that don't agree with him on everything, and they've had those discussions. And yeah, like you said, it is. Yeah, you put your point across, and all right, we'll go on with our lives or whatever. That was a good episode. Thanks, appreciate that.
Right.
You know, so, I don't really have anything else to add to this. I mean, the whole thing though was just that. When you're in your Substack talking about this whole thing, I was just thinking, I mean, it's another, and I know we've kind of like beat the point on people's head, you know, the hammering it in, but it really is another prime example of just going into the lion's den, not having any control over what is going to be on air. And that's why podcasts, even something as small as this one or wherever, that's why podcasts are growing, and there's so many of them, because they'd rather just go on there, especially if it's not something that's completely edited. Because I mean, there are a lot of podcasts out there that do have that production or whatever. Like, I mean, this one's just, you know, click and boom or whatever.
Right. So like, yeah. So my videos, when I do stuff, typically I don't do live stuff, or I don't do long form stuff. I have a specific point I'm trying to make, or my videos are as long as they need to be for whatever the talking point is when I do them. But I think the biggest problem that if you're sort of adjacent to the liberty sphere, like I'm saying more adjacent than in it, is you don't see our viewpoints regardless of where you stand. I mean, you can be, let's use, like, you can be open borders or a Hapatarian. Like, it doesn't matter. You can believe in an ethno state or versus not. And you don't see those views portrayed on television, on network TV, on most shows. You know, that's why so many people are so excited when they see Dave Smith on Joe Rogan, because you're like, I don't see my views, even the ones I agree with or whatever. I don't see those really represented in the media. Mm-hmm. And so there's this impetus to be like, I was asked to be on the Dr. Phil show. I'm going to go on there and I'm going to, you know, say my piece, or I'm going to push back on this talking point or try to make sense of this. And then you're like, yeah, but I kind of can't. I mean, that was like when you had messaged me about this episode, I didn't even hesitate. I literally, before the only reason it took me a while to respond to you is to make sure it was cool with my wife, because we have to like arrange around our kids to make sure there's a famous video of a dude that was doing an interview and his kid like ran in the room while he was doing it. And I'm like, I'm never going to have that. Like, I'm not doing that. So I didn't hesitate. And I'm like, no, it'll be an honest discussion. I like them. We get along. We're cool. So not a problem. But it's frustrating because it's my own ego, but it's an animosity that I've had with the libertarian world, is that even in the libertarian world, I don't feel like my views are represented a lot of times. Like when I was sued by my city, you were the only person. There was you and Thank You for Your Servers was the other show. And that was a friend of mine, Gary, and Thaddeus were the guys who ran that episode. I think were the only shows that had me on. And at that time, the libertarian world was running shows about the Loser Brigade and, you know, all of the progressives in the Libertarian Party and whatnot. And you're like, I'm being sued by my city over the First Amendment, the ACLU's on my side, the EFF's on my side, all these things. And nobody in the liberty world, by and large, cared. With the exception, I would say, in the Libertarian Party, Angela McCardle cared, because she had me come talk to her group in LA. And this is back before, obviously, before she was chair of the LP. And so she cared. But she didn't have a podcast or anything. Like nobody in the media side of that, except for you and Thank You for Your Servers, cared. And so it was like, okay, well, I have no support in that network. Where else is there? So when I started doing videos on TikTok or what have you, or had a following, more people on the right reach out to me than people in the liberty world. And so when you're like, oh, I can reach them with my views. And then when the Dr. Phil episode messages me, I'm like, oh, I can reach 2.5 million or whatever the number was, like 2.2 million viewers that he has, plus syndication, with maybe a smart talking point, maybe something that can push back. Obviously that didn't happen because I felt like they cut everything, but you feel like that's the case. But no, it's frustrating. You got to sort of figure out what matter, who you can reach and who you can't, and what shows are going to help you with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, of course. So yeah, we'll just end it there. Let people know where they can find you and where they can, follow you and all that good stuff.
So it's I think I have it behind me. The Hourly Struggle. It's pretty much any social media. YouTube, TikTok are the primary places. So short videos on TikTok, longer form videos on YouTube. Occasionally I'll do the Twitter thing every now and again. And then obviously Substack as well. So hourlystruggle.substack.com is the other. Patreon, obviously, as well, because I am a capitalist. So I like money. Yay.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and talking about your experience over on the Dr. Phil show. And, if you get sued again by whatever other city, then we'll definitely have you on for that. Talk about your. Yeah. So to everyone, thank you for watching and listening, and tune in next week, where our guest will be the host of It's Too Late, Alan Mosley. He's scheduled to come on. We'll see. Maybe he'll run late from It's Too Late. I don't know. Maybe he will be late. Who knows? Anyway.
It's going to have you on, man, but it's too late.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. All right. Have a good one. We'll see you in the next one. The truck's backing up because they're hearing us. I think it's time to end this episode.
And smash that like button.
Yeah, smash that like button.
Just break your computer.
And don't forget to subscribe. Hit that subscribe button.
Bye.
Okay, bye.